Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into something truly unique, a real historical gem. We've got William Fulbeck's 1608 work, Abridgment, or rather A Bridge of Roman Histories, to pass the nearest way from Titus Livy's to Cornelius Tacitus.
Quite a mouthful, isn't it?
It is, but think about it, a book from the early 17th century offering a shortcut, if you will, through the massive histories of Livy and Tacitus. I mean, that in itself is pretty remarkable. What we're going to do today is explore what Fulbeck considered the key takeaways from these Roman histories, especially as they relate to, well, the really dramatic story of the late Roman Republic.
And what's particularly interesting, I think, as we get into this, is that we're not just looking at Livy and Tacitus through our modern lens, but through the eyes of someone living over 4 centuries ago. It's like this double layer of historical interpretation, which can give you a much richer understanding of how these ancient texts have been received and understood across time. You know, how their meaning has evolved.
That's a great point. And in his preface, Fulbeck, he addresses the reader directly, kind of cool, and mentions this was no small feat. He spent, get this, 14 years compiling this abridgment.
Wow, 14 years. Talk about dedication.
Right. His goal, though, seems pretty clear. To make Roman history more accessible, to provide that nearest way through Livy and Tacitus. He even acknowledges that others, like Appy and Plutarch, had already tackled this, covered similar ground, but he felt his approach would be particularly useful, sufficient. And to really put us in his shoes, he dates his dedication from his, quote, chamber in Gray's Inn on October 13th, 1608.
1608, that's important. I mean, it places Fulbeck in an early modern England that was deeply, deeply engaged with classical thought. You have to remember that during this time, these ancient histories, they weren't just academic exercises, They were viewed as sources of wisdom for governance, morality, understanding the rise and fall of civilizations, lessons that Fulbeck clearly wanted his readers to grasp, to internalize.
Okay, so how did Fulbeck structure this bridge, so to speak? He divides it into 3 books. The first is titled Clotho, a reference to one of the 3 Greek fates, the spinner of the thread of life. It begins with the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud and the establishment of the Roman Republic. Fulbeck estimates this first book covers roughly 600 years of Roman history. So for our deep dive today, we're going to focus on some of the key events and figures he highlights in Clotho. It gives us this unique early 17th century perspective on Rome's foundational centuries, the period that set the stage for everything that came after.
And that title, Clotho, it's quite evocative, isn't it? It suggests that Fulbeck's focus in this first book is really on the very beginnings, the initial conditions, those forces that shape the destiny of Rome.
Absolutely. So diving into Clotho, one of the first things that jumps out is how Fulbeck emphasizes this internal friction within the young republic. He notes the Senate, obviously wanting to maintain their authority after the kings were ousted, clashing with the common people, the plebeians, who desired greater freedoms. This tension, according to Fulbeck, led directly to the creation of the tribunes, these officials specifically tasked with protecting the plebeians from, potentially the overreaching power of the patrician-dominated Senate. He even points out that initially, marriage between patricians and plebeians, it was forbidden.
And what's really insightful here is how, from its very inception, the Roman Republic wasn't this, monolithic entity. It was this dynamic system grappling with these really fundamental power struggles. This early conflict between the elites and the commoners, it was a key driver of political and social change in Rome, shaping its laws, institutions for centuries to come. I mean, think about it. That initial marriage ban, it really highlights the deep, deep social divisions of the time.
Right. And yet, despite all this internal conflict, Fulbeck also makes a point of underscoring Rome's impressive growth and, its almost constant military successes.
Yeah.
He paints this picture of a state that, even while dealing with its own internal issues, was constantly expanding its territory and its influence through military might. He specifically mentions these famous Roman families, the Curii, the Coruncani, the Fabritii, the Marcelli, and the Scipiones. He calls them out as outstanding examples of Roman, quote, magnanimity in war, and their, quote, temperance and loyalty in peace. It's quite the testament to their character, at least as Fulbeck sees it.
And for listeners, I think this emphasis on Roman virtue, particularly in the context of military expansion, speaks to this long tradition of viewing Roman history as a source of moral lessons. These families, they were often presented as like the paragons of Roman character, embodying those qualities believed to be the foundation of their success. But it does raise a question. How do these idealized portrayals reconcile with the internal strife that Fulbeck also describes? It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. Now, to help organize this long, early period, Fulbeck divides the first 600 years of Rome into four distinct ages. He says the first, under Romulus, focused on the founding of the city and its initial institutions. The second age, that involved territorial expansion and lots of conflicts with neighboring peoples. The third age, spanning about 150 years, he describes as a peak of conquest and the firm establishment of Roman dominance. And the fourth age, which he calls, quote, the youth of the Roman monarchy, kind of interesting choice of words since the monarchy had already ended, saw the rise of these prominent families and further expansion.
The youth of the Roman monarchy, yeah, that phrase is a bit contradictory on the surface. But I think what Fulbeck is getting at is this period where the seeds of these powerful families, who would later dominate the Republic, were sown. Even under the rule of kings, there was this undercurrent of ambition and influence. And I think Fulbeck's periodization is a way of trying to make sense of this vast sweep of history, identifying key phases of development, which is something historians still do today, although with different frameworks, obviously.
Right, right. So let's focus now on some of those key figures and turning points that Fulbeck highlights within this structure. He starts, unsurprisingly, with Tarquin, labeling him the, quote, vainglorious Tarquin, whose, and here's the full quote, shameful rape of Lucrece, which, just to clarify, was committed by one of his sons, directly led to the expulsion of the kings and the establishment of the Republic. He presents this as a very clear consequence, cause and effect.
Yeah, the story of Lucrece and the overthrow of the Tarquins, that was a really foundational narrative for the Roman Republic. It emphasizes this rejection of tyrannical rule and the embrace of civic virtue. And it's important to recognize how these origin stories really shape a society's understanding of itself and its values. Fulbeck, he's reiterating a powerful, very well-established myth.
He then moves on to Camillus, praising his virtue and magnificence after the Romans captured Veii, which was, quite the feat. And he contrasts Romulus, the founder, with Numa Pompilius, the second king, suggesting these different but equally vital contributions to the early state. He also lists Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, and Servius Tullius as the subsequent kings, each playing a part in Rome's growth.
So far, it's a pretty standard recounting of early Roman history, wouldn't you say? Absolutely. And I think these figures represent different facets of early Roman development. Romulus as that strong, almost mythical founder, Nero as the bringer of law, religious tradition, and then those subsequent kings who really expanded Rome's physical and political reach. Fulbeck is laying out that traditional lineage, those key influences on the nascent republic.
But this is where the narrative, at least through Fulbeck's eyes, starts to shift towards the later republic and what he seems to see as the beginnings of its decline. He marks the emergence of real civil strife with the story of the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Caius and their, he calls them seditions concerning land distribution and the rights of Italians. He notes the violence and the factions that arose from their actions. It's almost as if Fulbeck sees this as a turning point, this shift towards internal conflict, a departure from that earlier temperance and loyalty he admired.
The Gracchi brothers are definitely widely considered a crucial turning point. Their attempts at reform, however well-intentioned they might have been, unleashed this period of really intense political polarization and violence. It exposed these deep social and economic inequalities within the Republic, and I think it really demonstrated how difficult it had become to resolve these disputes through traditional political means. Things were really escalating.
And then, of course, we get to the really intense rivalry and outright civil war between Marius and Sulla. Fulbeck, he doesn't shy away from the brutality of it all. He mentions, quote, cruelty and prescriptions that marked their conflict. He details their power struggles and the huge impact they had on Rome. Interestingly, he also notes Sulla's actions in reforming the state, particularly his efforts to strengthen the authority of the Senate. But as we know, these reforms ultimately didn't prevent further conflict down the line.
No, they didn't. The Marian-Sullan Civil War was a truly cataclysmic event for the Republic, and Fulbeck is right to emphasize its brutality. This period really illustrates the complete breakdown of those traditional Republican norms and the rise of these incredibly powerful individuals who could, command armies and openly defy the Senate. Sulla's attempt to restore senatorial authority, it was kind of a temporary fix. It didn't really address those deeper issues of ambition and the erosion of the traditional checks and balances. And what's fascinating here is how Fulbeck, writing centuries later, pinpoints this as a key stage in the Republic's unraveling.
And then he recounts Catiline's conspiracy against the state, right?
Yeah.
Highlighting Cicero's role in uncovering and suppressing it. He portrays Catiline as being driven by this dangerous ambition and Cicero as the resolute defender of the Republic. It's kind kind of a classic story, the threat to the state overcome by the virtuous leader.
It's a compelling narrative. Catilin's conspiracy is a really valid example of those internal threats that the late Republic faced. And Cicero's actions in thwarting it, well, they really solidified his reputation as this great orator, this staunch defender of Republican institutions. I think Fulbeck's focus on this event really underscores the fragility of the Republic and how important it was to have individuals willing to stand against those who sought to undermine it through these, illicit means.
And moving even closer to the Republic's final years, Fulbeck discusses Pompey the Great. He notes his early military successes in Spain, his campaigns against pirates. He really emphasizes Pompey's ambition and his immense popularity. It's like he's setting the stage for those major players in the Republic's very dramatic conclusion.
Yeah, Pompey, as Fulbeck presents him, embodies both the military strength and that potential for personal ambition that really characterized the late Republic. I mean, his extraordinary commands, his popular support, it made him a force to be reckoned with. And he really represents a step away from those traditional norms of Republican leadership, where power was meant to be more diffuse, more evenly distributed.
And then, of course, we have Julius Caesar. Fulbeck touches on Caesar's early career and his complex relationship with Pompey and Crassus, foreshadowing the eventual breakdown of their alliance, the First Triumvirate. He also mentions Caesar's military campaigns in Gaul as the source of his growing power and influence, which, as we all know, would ultimately overshadow, well, everything else, even the Republic itself.
Caesar's Gallic campaigns were absolutely transformative, not just for Rome's territorial expansion, but for Caesar's own political and military standing. Understanding this period is so crucial because it demonstrates how military success could be directly translated into this immense personal power, ultimately challenging the authority of the Senate and really the very foundations of the Republic. And Fulbeck, he clearly sees this as a critical development.
And finally, in this section on Clolo, Fulbeck brings us to the First Triumvirate itself. He describes it as an, quote, uneasy alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. He points out those, quote, growing signs of future conflict, and he really emphasizes the individual ambitions of each leader and those underlying tensions that were tearing the Republic apart from within.
The First Triumvirate was never going to be a stable situation. It was this temporary arrangement, really driven by the personal ambitions and strategic needs of these three incredibly powerful men. It highlights how personal rivalries and this pursuit of individual power could destabilize even the most seemingly robust political structures. I mean, the inherent contradictions within that alliance, they were always going to lead to conflict. It was almost inevitable.
So, to sum up our deep dive into Fulbeck's A Bridge of Roman Histories, specifically Book 1, Kilo to Go, we've seen how a 17th century scholar viewed the dramatic early and middle periods of the Roman Republic. He highlights those initial power struggles, that remarkable military expansion, and the rise of these individuals whose personal ambitions, at least in Fulbeck's view, played a significant role in the Republic's eventual demise. It's fascinating. What stands out to you most in Fulbeck's interpretation?
What's really fascinating to me, and hopefully for our listeners, is how Fulbeck, writing so long after these events, is still wrestling with these really fundamental questions. What makes a republic succeed? What leads to its downfall? His emphasis on those internal social tensions and the ambition of these key individuals, it's a perspective that continues to resonate even today, especially when we think about the challenges faced by democratic societies.
It really makes you think. And reflecting on Fulbeck's work, it is striking how the actions and ambitions of individuals can be both the engine of a state's growth and the catalyst for its destruction, even in these seemingly strong, robust systems. So, considering the figures and events we've discussed today, from the virtuous Camillus to the ambitious Caesar, what parallels might you, our listeners, draw to leadership and power dynamics in other historical periods, or even in our own time? It's something to consider. The questions raised by this historical deep dive into Fulbeck's Bridge, they continue to resonate across the centuries, prompting us to think about the enduring lessons of the Roman Republic. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.